Hello everybody and welcome back to the 20 Years of Women on Boards podcast with me, Claire Braund, the co-founder and CEO of WOP. Today we're talking to Robin Buckham from Victoria. Robin's an experienced non-executive director and chair who spent 3 decades in the tertiary education sector, including as Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Deakin University and General Manager of Uni Advice at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales. Prior to her public sector successes, Robin built a general management career in a tough commercial manufacturing environment, transforming an ailing steel business into a competitive logistics provider in the Australian and Asian markets. She now serves across a range of boards, including as chair of Gippsland Ports, and has also taken up masters rowing. So hello and welcome, Robin.
Hello, Claire. Thank you for having me.
Robin, our early years are formative in shaping our values and the choices that we make. You grew up in Sydney and you went to North Sydney Girls before completing an arts degree at the University of Sydney. Can you tell us about the early life influences that have shaped you?
I think, Claire, like for many women of my generation, seek the mother out. She grew up in a working class family, was forced to leave school at the age of 15 when she desperately didn't want to. And then the war broke out. Hallelujah, a career. She joined, she became an officer and had spent those formative years in her 20s really learning lots of skills and being somebody. And when the war ended and they all said to the women, well, back you go, pop your apron on, she said no, and travelled the world. And I think learned lots of things about the formative power of education, the transformative power, I should say, and she's transmitted that to all her children, of whom I'm obviously the oldest. I think then North Sydney Girls itself was formative too, because it was a selective girls' high school and there were simply demands placed on us. We were expected to be someone and people rise to their expectations, I think. The arts degree at Sydney, honestly, it was the time, a very political time, and we did land rights for gay Wales. We demonstrated constantly. Lucky I passed, really. So all those influences shaped the breadth of my curiosity, I think.
From an arts degree, you moved into steelmaking in the late 1970s and early 1980s, spending 15 years at tube makers, eventually going on to manage a $200 million steel pipe mill before you left. How did you make the transition from the arts degree to steelmaking, and what did running heavy industry teach you about leadership that later shaped how you sit around a board table?
The arts degree was meant to turn me into an English history teacher, and it did, and I loved it. But the education department at that time in New South Wales thought it would be a really good idea if you went to work in Burke or Cobar. That was not at that point on my agenda, and so I suddenly left teaching, and I'd never intended to leave. Tube makers hired me as their internal communications person. I wrote the magazine, basically, but I was in the HR department. And in those days, you couldn't be in HR without it becoming IR. It was very industrially active. And so I learnt a lot about broad facets of HR. Then I married, and my then husband was working in Wollongong, so I moved to the Wollongong tube makers plant as HR director. And 18 months later, the manager left and they said, would you like to run the steel plant? I looked behind me to see if they were talking to someone else. So it was really a series of outlandish small steps that led me into that position. But I guess the point was they knew how to make steel, but they couldn't run an IR environment. It was just strike after strike. And I guess that was one of the things that I turned out to be quite good at. So I transformed that business, and the federal government gave us a $500,000 grant for that transformation, just in learning about how to manage the process, the people, and make it all work better. So that's how all that happened. I guess what did that teach me about leadership? The interesting part about managing a heavy engineering business and not being an engineer was that you had to learn how to pick people who knew stuff like engineering and accounting and trust them to get on with it. So it taught me about leadership, and it's been a very good lesson for boards, because when you go on a board, you don't run the business. It's not your job. It's management's job. And so that learning to understand who would be good at doing what they had to do and letting them get on with it under the umbrella of a strategy you helped devise, I think that was that taught me that kind of process.
Great story. From this unusual launch pad into governance and later into academia and NFP leadership, because of course you went back to the tertiary education sector, you then decided that your careers would go to move from operations into strategy and boards. So was it a conscious decision, or was it a case of serendipity?
I think serendipity. I reckon, Claire, people's careers only make sense to themselves when they look back at their life rather than as they're moving forward through it. When I was in the tube maker's role, we exported pipe sent around Australia. So I had to use the port a lot. I turned out to be one of those people who complained when I didn't get good service. And they asked me to be on the board of the port of Port Kembla. And I was there for 15 years. They sort of forgot to take me off. But that process of being on that board taught me a great deal. It had been a clunky maritime services board. You know, it was run by the maritime unions, very, very old-fashioned, and we had to modernise it. And I had a series of very good chairs, culminating in Nick Whitlam, who helped with that process. Nick said to me, because I'd always avoided audit and risk, hate audit and risk, "You're going to be on the audit and risk committee." And then he said, "You're going to chair it, mate." And he taught me to take on things that I hadn't found interesting and thought I couldn't do. So I learnt a lot from that board. Also, while I was there, Paul Keating asked me to chair the very first regional development boards they had in Wollongong. So then I learnt about the broader scope of a public sector board that was trying to improve a local area. So those two things were serendipitous, really. Once I left big jobs, in other words, retired from the DVC, a deacon role, I sort of looked around and started doing interim exec work. Now, I reckon interim exec is a wonderful bridge from full-time big executive jobs to board jobs, because you are but you're not, and it's that transition process. So out of that, I then started looking for properly board roles. And my very first one, apart from some not-for-profits, was the College of Sport and Exercise Physicians. And I only went to that board because of their logo, or their tagline. And their tagline was, "Exercise is medicine." And it was really something I believed in, a sort of move it or lose it, you know. And so I joined that. And if I look then at the boards I've joined, it's always been about the passion for something that they were doing, I think, or some transformation. I'm a fixer-upper, and I like transforming things. So those seem to be the threads.
So tell me, the move it or lose, what is it? Move it or lose it. The move it or lose it.
Exercise is medicine, properly put, yes.
Have you always been sporty? Because
No, absolutely not. No, my father was an Olympic rower, and he said, "You're never rowing because girls get big shoulders," because the sport's changed since then. But no, my mother had this strong education thing. Sport was for idiots. You know, real people did academic things. So no, and it wasn't until my children went to school and started being quite interested in sport, I couldn't talk them out of it. And my daughter rowed, and, you know, you go along at 5 o'clock in the morning and dump the child and think, this can't be hard. I'll give it a go. It turned out to be quite hard, but I've been giving it a go ever since.
And it takes you around the world.
Absolutely. Oh, look, we go to a regatta and we have to stay away for 5 weeks. Well, it's in Europe. What are you to do, you know? So it's getting more and more out of hand, I have to say.
That's great. That's a great story. You were for a time as well the CEO of Family Business Australia, so spent years inside family enterprises. And you probably know a little bit about the governance initiatives or non-initiatives in that sector. And they don't always extend to a higher proportion of non-family directors on boards. Is this still the case? And if so, why has the shift been slow and why is it needed?
So certainly I think it's been slow. I'm not close, now to the sector necessarily, though you come across family businesses, there's a lot of them. The genesis for it all, of course, is that they were founded by somebody. And they were founded by a bloke or a woman who are passionate about whatever they're doing, running a flower shop, Gina Reinhardt. There's all sorts of sizes in family businesses. And the difficulty is that they don't like to give the passion away. They don't share the power, really. Asking them to share it with a non-executive director is even harder than asking them to share it with their son. So, it's just a bridge too far. And why do they need it? Well, they need the perspective. They need the other perspective of being outside the company, those external experiences and other industries' perspectives too, I think. We used to say that you had to have a founder retire to something, not from it. So there had to be more of an impact, and I think it's true of people, more of an imperative to go away than there was to stay. So finding Dad something to do was pretty important. I would say that the most successful ones defined the family business in a clear way. Either the family business was around flower shops or something, let's get more of them, but one particularly wise one that I knew well defined the family business as being for the family. So one of the daughters, for example, was a nurse. Or they weren't running a nursing business, they were running a logistics business. That didn't matter. They bought her a nursing home. They created a portfolio of things that worked for that family. Now, that's one definition. It's not the only one. But understanding what your definition is and acting according to it is important, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The hardest conversation, of course, in succession planning can be admitting that it's needed, which is what you just spoke to. Is there an equivalent conversation that boards avoid in the corporate sector? Because you can quite often get almost a founder-style syndrome that happens with CEOs and things as well. There has been ASX-listed companies which have almost functioned in the same way, Robyn.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So I would say one of the hard conversations is succession planning, indeed, inside companies, both for board directors and for the CEO, of course. You probably shouldn't be tinkering too much below that. The hard conversations are always about strategy, not about having one for a start and then staying with it. There's a lot of hubris in boardrooms, people who see pink pigs flying and think, let's go there. And I spend a lot of my time now as a non-executive director on boards. I'll give you an example. The Law Institute of Victoria, I'm not a lawyer, and they have deliberately, much to their credit, hired 3 non-lawyers. And that gives a great other perspective. I wondered whether, when I went on, what do I have to offer? These people know the Corps Act. What am I here for? But there were many things about the running of a board, how an in-camera, or many things that I could contribute to that, and particularly the notion of staying with the strategy and not following other passing pigs. I guess the idea too that a really basic one, that turnover's vanity, profit sanity, and cash flow's reality.
Say that again.
Okay. Well, it's turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash flow is reality. I had a boss at the steel industry that said that when I said how well I was doing on something, and he said, "What's your cash flow like, love?" It's it's the question that stops the world, really. So anyway, there's some commonalities across every board. It is about strategy, and people get I mean, AI at the moment, if I have another meeting that's entirely about AI, I may scream. I know it's important, but losing sight of your broader strategies, not good.
Your board career spans a financial complaints authority, the medical college you've spoken to, the Rice Growers Association, which of course we haven't mentioned yet, ports, numerous of them, a cemetery trust, TAFE. You've said that transformation and growth is one of the big things that's the through line for you in deciding which boards to join. Is there anything else that, really sort of makes you think, yeah, I would like to give that one a go?
I think the opportunity to make a difference, we've talked about, the renovation piece, making worthwhile things better. I fell in love, lived in Wollongong for 20 years, and I fell in love with regions and the importance of regions. That's why the rice growers appealed to me, because I'd moved to Melbourne. It's not very regional, Melbourne. And so, having an opportunity to go to a region again was important. I think I've discovered lately that I leave boards if I can't make a difference. One of the things about getting old, of course, you think, well, there's limited years here. I'm going to spend it where I can make the most impact. So that's certainly been something. I've got to be passionate about the mission, and I've got to be curious about the business. I say to people, I'm busy today, I'm going to the cemetery. Oh, they say cemetery. Cemeteries are enormously exciting places and very important rites of passage. The one that I'm on the board of, we have 40,000 roses, more roses than anyone in Australia. We make our own honey. We run a wellness centre. We do grief counselling. And the opportunity to serve so many communities, and there are sometimes rites of passage when you go back to your cultural roots, and weddings are one of them, and death is another. So, the Vietnamese community does death better than anybody I know. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways of us not being monocultural when we come to death. So I just find it fascinating. So I think I have to be fascinated too.
Yeah, no, I often speak about cemetery trust boards, as you know, because people do not know how interesting they are. So chairing Gippsland Ports, which you've done now for a number of years, means balancing, I suppose, the management of Crown lands, multiple waterways and 5 local ports across multiple regulators and ministers. How is governing a public entity with that many stakeholders different, do you think, from a commercial board?
Well, we have one key stakeholder, of course, and that's government, rather than a shareholder. So the minister's point of view is important. It doesn't mean we always have to agree with it, and I have a great minister from the Minister of Ports in Victoria, and we talk a lot about, what we both think about things, but the primary duty is to them and through them to the public. So we're serving people. Cemeteries too are run as a service. Now that doesn't mean you can't be business-like. I used to say at universities, you can never say at universities that you're a business, you'd get shot, but you should behave in a business-like way. So there's still that discipline to be applied to businesses, I think, but with the public service overlay. There's more stakeholders, though. Of course, there's the local community. You mightn't like the fact that you're not repairing their jetty, which will cost $10 million to repair, or only 2 people fish on it. There's all of those kind of issues that you have to balance. And certainly with a cemetery, if we want to expand them, then there's not many people that welcome a cemetery in their back garden. So, there are many and various issues and stakeholders to manage, and all of them have a legitimate voice. And I think that's the thing that's most difficult to balance on a public sector board, but rewarding too.
What ports do you look after in the Gippsland region?
Well, it's actually all of them, from the New South Wales border all the way around to really to the outside of Melbourne. But they're only little. There's the big commercial one is Corner Inlet, going out to the offshore rigs and so on, which are being dismantled. But lots and lots of jetties and local council areas. There's land associated with ports too, as well as water. Lots of commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen. So it's a broad church.
You studied at Columbia, we're going back a bit now, and built a career at a time when there were far fewer women in the professional sectors and certainly far fewer women in commercial manufacturing in leadership roles. What do you think's changed most for women entering the workforce since then, and what hasn't changed enough?
Well, women are far more likely to be engineers than they were. There were a few engineers. Unfortunately, the percentage isn't by any way, shape or form 50%. So, we haven't gone far enough, I think, in the sciences, in the STEMs, with getting women to do those jobs. Oh, the other thing, Claire, is the maternity leave. Lordy Lord. Maternity leave itself is better, but childcare. Looking at my children's friends, I don't have any grandchildren, no one's cross, but looking at those issues around maintaining their careers and managing childcare. We have some interesting graphs on that in the Law Institute. A percentage of women in the law graduating cohort, 75% are now women. But look at their careers. They go like whoosh in their 20s, and I've discovered it. They're about 32, whoop, away we go. Because the culture in many large law firms still is, 7 a.m. till midnight, and if you're married to another lawyer, that doesn't work. So I think systemic change in the way we view people interacting in those careers is very important, I think, and still got more work to do. The Productivity Commission did a very good report some years ago that said the biggest single way we could increase productivity in this country is to keep all those educated women in the workforce, and the way to do that was to improve childcare.
It's interesting, isn't it? You talk about that 7 till 12 and the lawyer being married to the lawyer. Well, it's a fair chance they will be, because they've got no one else to meet, because they've got no social...
Yeah, all these professional people marrying and then saying, well, whose career will it be, because it can't be both.
And invariably, because men earn more, which, again, don't get me started on the gender pay gap, is a huge problem. And it is fascinating that still the majority of partnerships at law firms, despite the 75% coming, and that's been quite high for quite a long time, we've still got most of the men at the top of those organisations. So, yeah.
I think it might be more than just the gender pay gap, though. I think there's still, I look around, the girls that my sons know, and there's still an expectation that the woman will step back, rather than be the one that goes on while he stays home. There's still an uncomfortableness about that, I think, in our society.
Robyn, you've been a WOB member for many years. Thank you. Have always appreciated. I love your sense of humour. And in that time, as we've discussed, your board career has taken off. Looking back on your journey, how important has WOB been to you in your board roles, and how would you describe the WOB community? It's
been very important, Claire. I remember I probably first met Ruth and then you very quickly after. You can't be what you can't see, and just being involved in boards where there were very, very senior women in your organisation and many, many women who were just starting out. So we had a really good range to draw on. Your community, this community, is supportive but not silly. Sometimes the supportive can be, everyone's wonderful, it's all marvellous what you've done. Well, that's really nice, but it's not very helpful, in fact. And so I think we're quite realistic about what is needed. You particularly must get sick of saying it, I think, but, just talking to people about they're not going to be an ASX director next week, no. And if you have a look at the careers of ASX directors, they were never like that either. So there are ways and ways of moving through this process. So I think we're not high flown. It doesn't mean we're not extraordinarily professional, and have a great, as I said, range of directors to look at and admire and understand. But we're practical at the bottom of it, and I think that's important. Thank you.
As the number of women on boards continues to grow across all sectors, we have hit 40% in many sectors, which of course was our target all those years ago, and WOB enters its next decade. What do you think is the next frontier?
One of the things that in Victoria is compulsory is that you have Indigenous members of your public boards. And poor Indigenous people are run off their feet. Everyone wants them. And so there are 2 on the Cemeteries Trust, and I have one on the Gippsland Ports Board. I'm getting to the woman part. They bring a totally different perspective. Now, many of them are not professional board directors by any manner of means. And we're so used to the AICD kind of model of how a board works, and they don't know about that. So they'll just come in and say stuff. And it's been remarkable, and I think perhaps we need to rethink a bit about what we think the perfect way to run a board is because of that input. Now, coming to women. Now, of course, we have women on boards, but by and large, they're women like you and I. You know, they're not women, working class women necessarily, nor indeed women from multicultural backgrounds always. So I think it would be more interesting on a board if we got some of the people on the board who the organisation seeks to serve. So, for example, in cemeteries, it's a funny thing, but everybody dies. And so there are all these different kinds of groups we could have more involved on board. So I think for me, women, yes, of course, but also thinking across the spectrum of women and working out ways to listen to all voices.
I love that idea of that diversity within and between gender. So finally, Robyn, what are 3 words you'd use to sum up your journey over the past 20 years?
Well, I'm going to sort of stretch that. Number 1 is it's been unexpectedly diverse. You know, if I think about back to me as a new graduate, I had a definite view about where that career was going to be. And I would say to everybody that their career is not going to be what they think it's going to be, not if they're keep being open-minded and having fun. The second thing would be, I think that it's been very fulfilling and rich because of its variety. And I think I pick up little nuggets from one industry and pop them into another. I love doing that part. So it's been that. But maybe most importantly, it's allowed me to contribute in some way. Now, that might be just code for saying it's allowed me to feel important. But, yeah, I like to be useful, I think, and it has allowed that.
Well, Robin Buckham, I think you have certainly been useful, and all the while not taking yourself overly seriously, which is a really lovely trait. So thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for your work.